Well, hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's session. Today's quick take session on the using the Azure Pipeline API for migrations to Office 365. The first thing I want to show you is, first of all, as of the latest release, 7.3, the Pipeline API is now available in FileShare Edition. So for moving files from your file shares into Office 365 can now be done through this pipeline. And to show you here what is and is not supported right now doing the SharePoint migrations. So basically we can see you have a document library, and as long as the library does not have any document sets, it's not a style library, does not contain any ASPX files, and is not an InfoPath library, it will go through the pipeline. If any of these are found in the document library, it will just go through the standard CSOM API. And then we'll also migrate list items in the lists that are listed below: custom announcements, contacts, custom lists, and the other ones here. Of course, you'll see the session will be up on our knowledge base, so you can go back and see the full list on the recording. So let's take a look. Let's go in and let's just take a look at the configurations and what you need to do to get the API working in your environment. Of course, the most important thing is to set up your Azure storage account. So as long as you have access to Azure, you can go in and create a new storage account. And of course, to test this, you can get a trial account, I think, that lasts about 30 days. And once you've created your storage account in Azure, then you simply go in to Manage Access Keys, and you'll have your storage account name and your primary access key or secondary access key. And these are important. You'll want to, you can just use the option here to copy the account and the key. And using those two pieces of information, you go into your environment settings XML file, and that would be the environment settings located in the C program data MetaLogics folder. And you can just edit the environment settings file while you'll have to close the console first, of course, and edit the file. And within the file here, you'll see an entry, the Upload Manager Azure Storage Connection String. This is the most important entry in order to get this API working for you. So what you have to do, and if you've never set it up before, you may just see something like this. Right? So there won't be anything in there at first. So you'll have to take this and just change it so that you add the value, and you'll set up your the default endpoint protocol is HTTPS, and then you just set your account name, and then you paste in the account key, and then you just close up the value tag. And once that's set and you save the file and load the console, you'll pretty much be able to start using the Azure API. So while I have this open, I just wanted to also show you a few key entries that you'd be interested in making as well. The first one is the local temporary storage. So here you'll see I've set mine to a local folder, Azure API, on my C drive. Of course, you can send this to any folder you like, but I would recommend not sending it to the C temp folder. I would recommend just creating your own folder dedicated to the storage and what we store in here, which I'll show you as well. The other key entries are the upload manager batches to upload, and I have it set here for 15. That means that it will do 15 items at a time. So that setting is for number of items or documents to go into a batch. And then this entry is the batch size threshold. So this would be 50 megabytes, which means we would for every 50 megabytes of data, we'll create a new batch. And what decides whether we use the item limit or the batch size is this entry here, the upload manager determine batch sizes by megabyte. I have this set to true now, so it's going to only look at this setting and will ignore this setting. And I'll show you, I've run a few jobs with the different settings and I have some relatively interesting results on that. Now, let me go and show you the actual, here we go. So this is what happens when you start doing migrations. It will start creating, each batch will be stored in a folder here, and within the folder you'll see the blobs. So these are, those were cleaned out after the migration. So so it's just the temporary storage here. But it gives you basically some extra logging per batch. So what happened during the upload process, and it also gives you extra information like the manifest. So how it works really is that when we upload a batch, we upload the blobs into the Azure storage account, and then we upload a manifest as well, which describes the documents or the items. And together, that's what, once it's in a batch, and it's uploaded into the pipeline. And let me just show you a log, which might better describe it. So this is the first job I ran, and this job I set the configuration file to use the item limit, and I used a 15 item threshold. So it goes through, it initializes the pipeline, and then it processes the documents, and then it does the upload to Azure. So it creates a batch, and then this batch along with the manifest gets uploaded into the Azure storage account, and then we tell the API that it's up there and it gets queued. And so each batch goes up and gets queued, and then the pipeline takes it from there, and it takes those batches and then transfers those documents into your Office 365 environment. So it takes those, and based on the manifest, it will assign all the metadata to those documents, so you lose nothing in the process. So we upload the batch, and then we process, and then we upload the next batch. And then what we're doing here in the log is that after we are uploading them, then we're requesting we send requests up into the pipeline to get the status. So then we're monitoring it, and then it's continuously monitoring, and then you see once we get a notification that it's been queued, so then we we do get the notifications from the API that once they start it, and then, you know, if there's any warnings up there, we'll get that, and then we'll get the notification when the batch is ended. And along the way, each of these items, we can see some details, and the job ID is important here because this will correlate to the folder that we have stored in our local storage. So we can go in and see extra logging once the job has ended, and you know, get details. And if there's any errors, we may end up with correlation IDs, which we can get from the Microsoft side if there's any fatal errors. So this is just a quick sort of look through on the log itself. So you see a lot more log items generated with a lot of information. But I wanted to sort of show you what I did here is I migrated one library with 29 files in it, a very like 1 kilobyte file, so not a big huge test or anything. So the first job I ran was using the 15 item threshold, and you can see it took 4 minutes 4 seconds to complete. So I then ran the same job using the just this plain CSOM connection, and I did not use the Azure API, and that job actually ran quicker. So what you can see is that with smaller batch sizes, it may not be an improved performance. It really does start to improve when you see a lot of content being migrated. But what's interesting is that I was able to change from the 15 item threshold to a 50 gigabyte threshold. So instead of batching by item size, I batched by content size. And so it put everything in one batch, and at this point it was actually quicker than the CSOM approach. So making subtle changes between these batch sizes can have a difference in the performance that you have. Sometimes it could depend on, you know, items versus documents, and if you have large libraries. It's all about, what it's all about is getting as many batches into the pipeline as possible, because we're uploading it into Azure. So if we can upload those and get the queue full so that the API can process those queues, that's what improves the overall performance. So in my case, in this test, it was using the upload batch size of 50 megabytes and determining, you know, using the megabytes instead of the items, that resulted in a faster migration. And we can see here that it would have only used, it would have processed all these and just used one batch. So for me, that was a faster for this. Now, we want to see, so in order to use the pipeline, it's quite straightforward and quite basic. So under the storage options, under my list content options, all I need to do to utilize the API is just check this one option to use the Azure Office 365 upload. So, yeah, are you sure? You know, as long as you do have the storage account set up, you're good to go. So you just hit yes, and that's all you need to do in the job configuration in order to go through the API pipeline. Okay, so I do see I have some questions here. So my first question, and here we can go into any Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, I might have glossed over something, you want a little more detail on something, I can answer your questions now. So one question is, how much storage should be allocated for the temp storage location? So you should get a good amount of storage allocated and available for that temporary storage location. It could depend on the quantity and the size that you're migrating, but I would say maybe as long as you had at least 50 gig free on that drive that you're using for the pipeline, that should be fine, because it should go through and delete those blobs. So another question, follow-up to that, is there any recommended Azure storage account size based on the amount of content being migrated? So I don't know if you can actually set a storage account size, but again, like we do clean up the local storage, we definitely clean up the Azure blob storage as the batches get complete. So once a batch is completed, we will clear out the storage inside of the Azure storage account. Now that's as of 7/2017. Prior to that, we were not cleaning out the Azure storage account, but I wouldn't recommend using the Azure API anything lower than 7/2017. So how can you set a batch file, and where can I set that in the XML environment? So how can you set a batch file? Where can you set the batch file? I'm not sure the question. So the batch, the batches are set within here, so you can set the storage here. I'm not sure if that was what the actual question was. Perhaps if you could clarify that one for me. I'm going to go to the next question. So as we've seen variable performance, have any specific configuration for batch with number of items or size in megabytes? Now by default, the upload size for batches is should be 25, I believe, and this is the 50 megabytes is the default threshold for megabytes. What we want to try to prevent doing is having batches that are too large. Now this is a really important point to make, is that if a batch is too large, then it's going to take us longer to upload that batch to Azure, and that's going to have a performance impact. Like I said, we want to get these batches uploaded into the API as fast as we can, so that it can then be processed by the API and by the Microsoft side of the API. So is there a happy medium in the configuration of batch sizes, like 25 megabyte versus 5 gigabyte? Well, I think we want to stick with batch sizes in megabytes, and this leads back to what I was saying. If you had a 5 gigabyte batch, then you're not really going to see any performance improvement because it will take a long time to upload 5 gigabytes of content up into the API. So when does it delete the blobs? This is the next question. So if I had 50 gigabytes of space available and 60 gigabytes of data to transfer, would I run out of space, or does it clean up as it completes each batch? Yes, it should. As soon as it completes the batch, it should clean it up. So so if you are migrating like a 60 gigs of data, and you have 50 gig of space available, no, that should be enough because it should be cleaning up as it goes. So is that a max? So next question, is that a max size limit for sites to be migrated? No, there's no size limit for the number of sites. There's no limits for sites or content. We can use this API to migrate site collections, full site collections that are hundreds of gigabytes in size. And there's no maximum size limit for sites, and so there's no maximum size limits of any type at all. Because everything gets batched out. So the next question: how can I access the environment settings.xml file? Well, what you do is you just open up your the file explorer on the machine running the console, and you navigate to see program data metalogics, and you'll just want to edit that file. Now you do want to be an administrator on the machine. Now in certain environments, maybe Server 2012, you might have to say run Notepad as administrator and then open the settings file up from that. It depends on the security settings on the operating system. So you want to make sure when you make changes to the environment settings file that you do close the console first. The settings won't take effect unless you close the console and then save the environment settings and then restart the console. It'll take the new settings. And of course, you can also you can configure the job, and you can also save it as a PowerShell script, and you can run these jobs using the pipeline via PowerShell. So the next question is a batch migration, all or nothing. What happens if it fails halfway? So a batch, there may be a failure in a batch. You could have a batch failure, which it will go on to the next batch, or depending on. So one example, I guess, if you could get a batch failure is, for instance, if you set the wrong account key in your settings file. So if I were to close the console and maybe just change this to an E, so make it incorrect, and then restart my console. So while that's happening, there's another question: what is the maximum batch size limit? So again, there's no limit to the batch size, but there are recommendations that you don't make batch sizes too big, because again, the bigger the batch size, the longer it will take to upload to the Azure environment, and the longer it may take to upload, you might be you might be seeing, more susceptible to any errors, timeouts, whatnot. So let's see now if we just let these load up, and then we can run a job with the pipeline, and I can see this should probably fail pretty quickly as soon as it tries to upload a batch. So while that's loading, we have, there's another one. We have configured an Azure SQL Server and installed Content Matrix on the server for a database connection, but having issues with it finishing jobs. So the API functions and uploads batches successfully, but then hangs permanently. Are there any compatibility issues with the latest version of SQL? I don't know if that has anything to do with the SQL side. It looks like it may have something to do with the Azure API side. The logs might say whether it's waiting, trying to queue it up if these batches aren't being queued up properly. Then that would be maybe an indication that something's wrong on the Azure storage account, or perhaps there is something there that perhaps maybe there may be an issue if it's full, or I want to look at if the blobs have been uploaded but they have never been cleared out, because they if we didn't hear anything back, then we wouldn't be able to go up and clean them out. So it might be a good idea in that case if you go in and clear those blobs manually, delete them all, and try another migration. So as another question is, would I recommend a doc library spanning batches, or is a doc library the smallest container for a batch? So we'll take, we'll copy the document library via the CSOM. So all the structure still gets copied through CSOM, and then the content within the list and libraries goes through the Azure API. So if you have a document library with 60 items and you're going on a 50-item limit, then it will split up the items or the documents in that library into two batches, but they'll get uploaded to the same container. So the libraries or the containers themselves don't determine the batches. And there's another question: does the ListView Threshold farm setting need to be modified for libraries that are over the threshold? So that's a good question, because we will first copy the container alone via CSOM, and then all the items after that are going to go through the Azure API. So that's a really good question, and I'm actually not sure if the API might be able to get around these ListView Threshold issues that we sometimes get when migrating all the content as well via the CSOM adapter. That's something I could look into actually testing and getting some more feedback on that one. Okay, so while that's running, to see what happens on error. So sometimes, going back to this question on what happens when these error out, there are some errors that we will see, and we will, usually if there's something wrong or a timeout, we will retry the batches in certain cases. In other cases, they would fail, and we would get the full failure details within the logs. Sorry, there is actually a document that comes with the download that does describe the whole API and the setup. So if we look at the so we have this Azure SPO migration pipeline guide, which does go through a lot more in a lot more detail. Goes through the full setup of the environment settings and what specifically what specifically each one does. So it gives you far more detail than I've given here on the quick take. So I recommend going through this document as well. Okay, versions. Do versions of documents also get migrated? Yes, they do. And what kind of internet speed would you require to appreciate speed improvement on this kind of workflow compared to migrating directly? Not sure. Like you want you know, good high speed internet to get this speed improvement. You could also, if you wanted to really improve, you could consider running the whole thing on an Azure VM, so that you have, and then mounting you can mount the database onto your Azure VM as well, and do a database to SharePoint copy to really improve the performance. Yeah, the documentation should be also available on the website. You can just download the zip file to get that documentation as well if you download the new package, the 7.301. You can also, if you do get failures, you can run an incremental to try and get those back up. And here's the error, by the way, just to wrap things up, going a little over time, but 403 forbidden. So if you do see this error, uploading a batch, it's pretty much a catastrophic error, and nothing's going to happen. So a 403 forbidden, the first thing you want to check then is, did you get your key set up properly in the environment settings file? Okay, sorry, I know it looks like we ran out of time. I know there's probably a lot more that we could discuss on this topic, but just thank you everybody for joining in, and I hope that I've been able to answer everyone's questions. If I didn't get to your question, I do apologize. So again, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming, and we'll see you next time.